Hello, this is Sacred Geometry Decoded, and this will be part 2 in this series, Measuring the Esoteric. It will be a series of links explaining some existing known research, but also some presenting new information in regards to the pyramids and ancient sacred sites such as the Kaaba in Mecca or the Temple Mount, how this will connect to the legend of Enoch, and how through geometry and measurement and what's generally under the sphere of now Masonic knowledge incorporates an ancient stream of knowledge, especially through the Quadrivium, which is music, geometry, arithmetic and astronomy, and how these ancient sciences are embedded not just in individual sites but also how they connect to one another, and especially through the Great Pyramid, how this can be not just understood but can be measured and verified. So because this information will be vital in future episodes into the minutiae of especially astronomical geometric connections in systems of measurement such as the ancient Egyptian Old Kingdom, Egyptian royal cubit, the meter and the allegedly modern English foot, how they all together actually blend into one another, and through geometry, through arithmetic and also through music, how they present a beautiful series of knowledge, of ancient knowledge that again that is tangible, it is measurable. And this goes to the Hermetic tradition. So Thoth and Seshat, ancient Egyptian gods of knowledge, maths, architecture, alchemy as in chemistry or medicine, but most importantly, gods connected to weights and measures and accountancy. Hermes or Mercury, the Greco-Roman god of knowledge, but weights and measures also, as was Wa Fu Hsi, the ancient Chinese gods of knowledge and measurement, who also hold the compass and the square. So the ancient gods of knowledge are all linked by one thing, and that is weights and measures, or science in general. Weights and measures, there is no science, whether it's chemistry, astronomy, geometry, it relies on weights and measure, including time as a measurement of time, and these all link together and can be demonstrated. So this is the famous image called Vitruvian Man by Leonardo Da Vinci. It is a study of ancient geometry as well as of measurement. This portion here is a giveaway to that, as is the name itself, Vitruvian Man, as in the Roman architect and engineer Vitruvius. The 10 books of architecture by Vitruvius are simply a must-read if you are at the least bit interested in ancient technology, including lifting technology, because it is a textbook of ancient knowledge. And what's more is, I'll put a link in the description as well to a video, just a shorter one, in regards to the transfer of knowledge. The ancient Greek and Roman writers tell us explicitly that they learnt their sciences through the Babylonians, Chaldeans, as well as the Egyptians. And that includes through Hieron of Alexandria, for instance, lifting equipment, or also through Vitruvius, who's the 10 books of architecture are simply a must read and essentially vital, because this was knowledge transferred to the Greeks and Romans. So Vitruvian Man by Da Vinci. This is another image by Da Vinci. There you will see the same geometry, the seed of life geometry, which was shown in part 1, which can be found, for instance, in the Osiron. So if we the flower there, we can see that's exactly the same geometry. It's also, well, throughout history you'll find it, and across the world. This is an example of a Roman market calendar. Again, the same geometry exists throughout these. This is the one thing that the more recent Hermeticists and alchemists share, as well as all the ancient cultures, really from China all the way across to the Western world. This image also incorporates sacred knowledge which can be shown to exist in places such as the Parthenon, but also the Great Pyramids, and especially all 3 of the Giza pyramids. So book 3 by Vitruvius, and the important portions here is the design of a temple depends on symmetry. So this is on symmetry in temples and in the human body. So the design of a temple depends on symmetry, the principles of which must be carefully observed by the architect. They are due to proportion in Greek. Proportion is a correspondence among the measures of a member to an entire work and of a whole to a certain part selected as standard. So the entirety is also the smaller parts must be symmetrical but related to measurement. From this result the principle of symmetry. Without symmetry and proportion there can be no principles in design of any temple. That is, if there is no precise relationship between its members, as in the case of those of a well-shaped man. The temple of man is the theme here. On the, again, still book 3 and chapter 3. Similarly, in the members of a temple there ought to be the greatest harmony in the symmetrical relationships of the different parts to the general magnitude of a whole. Then again in the human body the central point is naturally the navel, the belly button, the umbilicus. For if a man be placed flat on his back with his hands and feet extended, and a pair of compasses centered at his navel, his belly button, the fingers and toes of his 2 hands and feet will touch the circumference of the circle described therefrom, and just as the human body yields a circular outline, so too a square figure can be made from it. Therefore, since nature has designed the human body so that its members are duly proportioned to the frame as a whole, it appears that the ancients had a good reason for their rule, that in perfect buildings the different members must be in exact symmetrical relations to the whole general scheme. Hence, while transmitting to us the proper arrangements for building of all kinds, they were particularly careful to do so in the case of temple of gods, buildings in which merits and faults usually last forever. As they say, time is, the Great Pyramid does not fear time, but also these other temples, they were built to last. They're at the very center. Like now with a Capitol building or a cathedral, great detail goes into the construction of these things, and so forth. Proportion and measurement will be an essential feature. Now we need to focus on this part because Vitruvius, who lived 770 to 15 BC, it appears that the ancients had good reason for their rule. We know that the Romans and the Greeks learnt from Egypt and the Babylonians. They learnt their astronomy, their geometry, and what they call philosophy. Philosophy essentially means science. Now it's more thought about the meaning of life, but philosophy, until not so long ago, like as in natural philosophy, meant science. It's still used now, natural philosophy. We know that they learnt these from the Egyptians. They told us that they learnt this from the Egyptians and Chaldeans, and as well as evidence that these ancient sciences also come through to India. So when Vitruvius, who is ancient by our standards, he talks of the ancients of Greece and Rome studied the ancient civilizations that come before them. When a Roman talks about the ancients, he's not talking about the Greeks. They explicitly tell us this in books such as Strabo's Geography. So this comes back to the concept, to the temple of man, how the human body relates to the geometry and how the measurements inside the architecture of temples is drawn from the human body and these beautiful natural proportions. Another very important architect is Claude Fayette Bragdon, 1866 to 1946. Mathematics is the handwriting on the human consciousness of the very spirit of life itself. Amongst his works includes some of these images where he talks the body of the archetype of sacred edifices. So Indian temples as well as Western cathedrals. Now that's quite old now, but it's in the modern period of history. This concept of the temple of man has been observed and spoken of by master architects. Claude Bragdon was an influential theosophist. We also have works such as Schwaller de Lubitz. Can it really be said before the day of our pretentious science, humanity composed solely of imbeciles and superstitions? He around about the same period, but the Temple of Man, he studied especially Egyptian temples and especially studied measurement systems therein, and he was one of the first to suggest that the relationship between the Egyptian royal cubit and the meter and, well, modern English imperial is embedded in ancient structures, and even the title, the Temple in Man. So this concept is a cross-time, cross-cultures, and the same similarity in legends, such as the flood story of Manu in India, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, or as in Plato and Atlantis, who was passed through the Egyptians. Now, they all have very different time frames. They're way off from one another, but the point is that embedded in the stories is very important mathematical, geometric, and systems of measurement. So one of the important things to consider here is, for if we measure the distance from the soles of a foot to the top of his head, and then apply that measure to the outstretched arms, the breadth will be found to be the same as the height, as in the case of plane surfaces which are perfectly square. In essence, if you, from fingertip to fingertip, if you extend your arms outward, it is the same as your height. This is an important feature, and we'll return to this. Also, for if a man be placed on his back with his hands and feet extended, and a pair of compasses centered at his navel, at his omphalos, at his umbilicus, the fingers and toes of his two hands will touch the circumference of the circle therein. So if you go straight out, arms straight out, legs straight down, you form a square. And if we extend these out and at this particular angle, which is an important one as well, we will find the circle, the Temple of Man, the geometry and the metrology which emerges from that, but also the importance of the compass centered on the navel. What's also important, we'll return to this, is that if the radius, so if the edge length of a circle is 8 units, then the radius of the circle would be 5. Now you could express that as 10 diameter to 8 the edge of the circle, but 8 to 5 is the important part, because that's the division of the compass. We need the compass to be 5 units, and therefore we get a square of 8 units edge length. This is also important because the compass is centered on the navel, or the omphalos, or also the umbilicus. Now, an omphaloskeptus in Greek is navel gazing, and now we think of navel gazing as a wasting time, so someone who's picking at their belly button. In the ancient times, it was an aid to meditation. It's also relevant, the link to this series will be in a description, because an omphalos, or a navel stone, or an umbilicus represented the center of the world, from which the point from which all things would be measured. For instance, this is the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, without going into the story of the Titans versus the Olympians. But after Zeus and the Olympians came to power, Zeus sent out 2 eagles in opposite directions. They come together above Delphi, and so he dropped the omphalos to mark that as the center of the world. Now we will see omphalos or navel stones or benben stones in important places, basically at the center of important places, such as Heliopolis or Hermopolis in Egypt, or Rome, Athens, even the London Stone, for instance. Now, so we see there is an essence to this geometry and to these proportions. Okay, now we go back to Vitruvius' 10 books of architecture. He also describes the 5 orders of architecture: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. So it's not just columns that he's describing, it's schools of architecture, the way in which a temple should be designed. For instance, a Doric columns or temple should have a triglyph, as where Ionic and these later styles will be much more, not only the columns themselves much more elaborate, also the decorations in the temple are much more elaborate. So it's not just about column, it's about the entirety of the design of the temples themselves. Now you may be wondering why I'm speaking about Vitruvius and these later columns. Well, they are, as we'll see, directly linked, containing some essential information that whole period. Now, it's often said that the Romans are closer to us than the Old Kingdom, that is true. So if the Old Kingdom, as they say, is between 5,000 to 4,500 years ago, well, the Romans were only 2,000 years ago. But the Romans are much closer, technologically speaking, to the Greeks than they are to us. So if you count it in years, which is very simplistic and incorrect in a deeper level, they are closer, but in a technologically, bureaucratically, in every other way, they are an ancient people connecting to Egypt. But the important thing is that the Greeks and Romans left us with documents that can be read in a modern sense, but also, as they tell us, they learnt from the Egyptians and Babylonians. Now, the importance of the Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian and Composite, well, it's also in the more modern tradition. So if we do a close-up, Composite, Corinthian, Ionic, Doric and Tuscan columns. We also have the two pillars Boaz and Yakim has spoken of in regards to the Temple of Solomon, and the two pillars of Enoch preserving that knowledge, which also preserved the 7 liberal arts. And what's on the top 7 steps? The 7 liberal arts, especially arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. It's also worth noting that these 5 columns are also related to the 5 senses, but that's more in the different field, so we're sticking with that. Now, also see the structure of Freemasonry. If we zoom in on this portion, we see the 5 columns once again. The important columns, though, to focus on are the Doric, the Ionic and Corinthian. These are the 3 Greek columns. A link in the description going into some of the connections to there, what they mean, and their origins and how they can be found in the modern world. But now I'll also link the secrets of the Parthenon. If you're interested, you really need to watch this, because, for instance, there are no right angles in the Parthenon. Again, it is often said, oh, but Greeks and Romans were just using square blocks. Well, no, they weren't. They were actually using gentle curved blocks. They appear to the eye to be squared off, but they are watertight and they have gentle curves. Now, for instance, these columns also have gentle curves. So to draw the curve in that column, you would need to draw a circle 1 mile in diameter, or maybe even 2 miles in. But if it's radius or diameter. But at the very least, you would need a circle 1 mile in diameter to get the gentle curve on these columns. Not a single right angle in the blocks at the Parthenon, watertight. It rivals, again, for instance, the polygonal stones, but they appear to be right angles. So there's actually an added dimension of difficulty in there. But off the topic, but Mark Wilson Jones, Secrets of a Parthenon, he talks about the Salama Stone, which is a very important conversion tool. It contains multiple sets of measure. It contains geometric information, which will also relate to astronomical information. And this also relates to Vitruvian Man. So, for instance, the Salama Stone, it also incorporates some other measurements, but for the moment, the Doric, the Ionic, and the common foot, or the common Greek foot, as in Doric and Ionic columns, still now in Masonry and other esoteric organizations have these columns as vital features. But the allegedly modern English foot is the Greek common foot, and so it's at least 500 BC. Now, given the fact, as I'll touch on it, that the same knowledge, geometry, astronomy incorporated into the Great Pyramid, for instance, is also incorporated into the Parthenon, and also the Roman writers of science in regards to their astronomy as well. They knew it, and it was embedded in their architecture too. So the Salama Stone is a conversion tool between multiple sets of measure. The capstone found next to the Red Pyramid, before it was vandalized by these antiquities people there, was 1 meter high and 3 Egyptian royal cubits wide, creating a scale model of the Great Pyramid. If you shrunk the Great Pyramid down to 1 meter, this is what it would be. And so again, we see 2 sets of important measures, the meter and the Egyptian royal cubit, as well as the foot, the Doric foot and the Ionic foot, and we'll come to this because it's all incorporated together, a fantastic set of knowledge. Now, The stone, Salama Stone, was broken. So how was this missing portion of the stone established? Well, here we see a tracing, and that's the missing portion here. So what we have is, that would be a 3:2 ratio if that was filled out in that particular way. And that would be a Vesica Pisces, a 3:2 ratio. Again, whether it's Ain Dara, stone circles is 3:2, which, so the center line, so from this corner, so from the, the center to the corner would be a 3-4-5 triangle. It's also 3:2 as in the perfect fifth, or what's called the Hermetic constant, still used in modern architecture related to the esoteric. Now, if it was filled out in this way, it would be 3.84 feet wide and 2.56 feet high. 256 and 384, they're also on your harmonic numbers chart, which relates to Pythagorean tuning. But it would just so happen that 3.84 feet is the square root of 5 Egyptian royal cubits to within 1/3 of a millimeter. Now, based on the nature of the stone, to get it to within 1/3 of a millimeter, you would need really modern standards of basically specialist labs to get that. It's well within acceptable margins of error. Well below that, and for instance, if any other lab was measuring an object, if I'm getting it to 1/3 of a millimeter, they'd be well above the acceptable margins of error. So modern standards should apply here as well. But what we have is, as we saw, this bar, this ruler, is 1 Doric foot. From that bar to the bottom is 1 Ionic foot, and we have also the English foot incorporated in there. And that is one way to establish not just the 3:2 ratio, but these measures, because that would make it exactly 4 Ionic feet wide. So from the tip of the forefinger to the center line of symmetry, because that corner would be the umbilicus, that would be the belly button, cutting the figure in two. So it matches with the Egyptian royal cubit, and 4 Ionic foot to the tip of the finger is 3 Doric feet. Now to the tip of this longest finger of that hand is 3 English feet. Now 1 foot is divided into 12 inches, uncia, which is related to the thumb. So as they say, a rule of thumb, the width of your thumb should be 1 inch. We also have fingers, or digits as they're called. We also have palms, which are another division of there. So that the Doric, Ionic are not just individually represented, but also leading to the larger parts connected together, just like with symmetry of temples based on the human body as described by Vitruvius in a very clearly written text, but also, as we'll see, in the Great Pyramid through measurements. The same philosophy and this system of multiple sets of ancient measure coming together at very beautiful harmonic spots is a very important constant. And for instance, also this line where the bar is 1 Doric foot, so from that to the top is 1.5 Doric feet, or 1 cubit, as the tip of a forefinger to your elbow represents there. Now there are a couple of other measurements including the same in here, but just for the moment to simplify it, the allegedly modern English foot, or the common Greek foot, Doric and Ionic, drawing this geometry and also linking to the Egyptian royal cubit at the square root of 5 Egyptian royal cubits, which is an important feature. It's not just a lucky number, it's integral to this system. Which brings us back to Vitruvian Man, being the compass being centered on the umbilicus, or the navel, or the omphalos. So just like with the Salama Stone, the umbilicus, or the navel stone, would be the point from which the smaller measure also incorporate the larger, just as described in Vitruvius's work, which creates the 3:2 ratio of the vesica. Now from the umbilicus to the top of the head, if that is 1 unit, then from the umbilicus to the soles of her feet is phi, or 1.618. The golden number, the golden ratio. As we mentioned earlier, if the compasses are set at 5, then the height or the width of the square is 8, and that in itself will come to an important set of measure, because this is also described in this work by Vitruvius, how different divisions of the human body will define the height of the person or the width from fingertip to fingertip at 8 units, but we'll get to that in the next part. So this brings us back to the pyramid, well actually the 3 Giza pyramids, and each one of these, the essential geometry of their construction is incorporated in this figure here, and it's sitting right there. So if we begin with Menkare's pyramid, the smallest of the 3. Now each of the pyramids one of them has a square base. The Great Pyramid has 8 sides, but even from corner to corner it is not a perfect square, it is slightly trapezoidal. This applies to the others as well, but the longest side of Menkare's pyramid is 200 Egyptian royal cubits wide. The Red Pyramid is 200 Egyptian royal cubits high. The Bent Pyramid is 200 Egyptian royal cubits high. This is, again, the geometry of these other pyramids will also come back to this, but just as an example, 200 Egyptian royal cubits wide, 125 Egyptian royal cubits high, which these are Fibonacci numbers, 8 and 5. So it's 8 wide and 5 high, 8 and 5. So I could do that circle, if I just move the compass around, it's 5 high, and the square is 8 wide. It's in there. Sheer coincidence, they'd say. Now, the Great Pyramid itself, based on the idealized measures, again, each side is different, but if we just average them out, what we have is that it's 440 Egyptian royal cubits wide at the base and 280 Egyptian royal cubits high. The numbers in here, if you include the slight variations on each side, actually gets much closer to the golden number. This is a good approximate, 1.61859, but it actually gets better. Now it might appear on the surface that would be that's such a small, to get that difference to 5.9, it is so small between 1.618033 to get phi. But so just, not rounding them off, that's what the number is. If you include the slight variations on each side, it actually gets much, much beautiful, much more closer. But it creates a 7 high to 11 wide, and the Great Pyramid is the Red Pyramid capstone is a replica of a Great Pyramid, but it is 1 meter high, which is an important feature. Again, we'll be returning back to that and how it connects to time and other measurement systems. But, well, if the half base is 1, then the slope is 1.61859. Again, we can reduce that if we incorporate, 1, 1.618, 1.618. So the Great Pyramid, the essence of it is described there. Now, Khafre's pyramid, it appears to be higher because it's on a higher level. It is actually 6 Egyptian royal cubits lower than the Great Pyramid as it was originally. Now, it just so happens that 6 Egyptian royal cubits is equal to pi meters. 6 Egyptian royal cubits is pi meters. This again will link. They're dropping hints, clear hints based on measurement. But what we have at 274 Egyptian royal cubits high and 411 Egyptian royal cubits wide, we have a 3:2 ratio, which brings us back to the Salama Stone at a 3:2 ratio, which means that the right angle triangle created by Khafre's pyramid is a 3-4-5 triangle. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. 3, 4, 5 is the first of the Pythagorean triplets. Now the pyramid is at a ratio, if the half base is 11, then the height is 14. Now if we consider the Parthenon, briefly mentioned it earlier, Mark Wilson Jones, and the Salama Stone, which incorporates the Doric, Ionic, and the common Greek or the modern English foot. So from the roof structure there, including the architrave, that would be 48 modern English feet, which would be 45 Doric feet, which would be 50 Ionic feet. It is a unity point. Just like the Salama Stone is a conversion tool between multiple sets of measure, you'll actually find that the pyramid, especially the Great Pyramid, or that red pyramidion capstone, is forming the same essential task at very lovely geometric proportions. If the height of a pyramid is 14, then the half base is 11. Including the architrave, 14 to 11, which incorporates the relative size of the Earth to the Moon, as well as much other important information. Just touching on this for the moment, because this is one example that the knowledge of and the geometry, the astronomy, the arithmetic of the Great Pyramid can be found in the Greco-Roman world. Actually can be found in places such as Stonehenge, because these same proportions are in stone circles and the measurement systems are in stone circles. I've done this in previous videos and earlier series. But what's also important is the Salama Stone, which incorporates these systems of measurement, the 3:2 ratio, or from the center line, from that corner across, would be a 3:4 rectangle, and that diagonal would create a 3:4:5. The first of triangle, the 3:4:5 triangle, is the first of the Pythagorean triplets. Therefore, the right angle triangle created by the Khafre's pyramid is a 3:4:5 triangle. From the long side to the top corner of the king's chamber is a 3:4:5 triangle, and Egyptian rope stretches 3:4:5 triangle. This a squared plus b squared equals c squared Pythagorean theorem, and the first Pythagorean triplet, the 3:4:5 triangle, is repeated not just in the Giza pyramids, but you'll find it elsewhere. And this same knowledge of the Great Pyramid, which is the capstone at the Red Pyramid, it's a 1 meter high version of the Great Pyramid, and the pyramid at Meidum had the same proportions. They repeated these. Now it's also worth noting that I think I mentioned already, the long edge of Menkare's pyramid is 200 Egyptian royal cubits wide. The height of a Red Pyramid and the height of a bent pyramid is 200 Egyptian royal cubits high. You'll see often repeated that other pyramids, or unfinished pyramids as they often called, are 100 Egyptian royal cubits high, wide at the base. But back to the 2:3 ratio of Khafre's, 2:3 ratio on the vesica of the Salama Stone. Well, 2:3 as well as 3:4, the perfect fifth and the perfect fourth in music, which incorporates the 3:4:5 Pythagorean triangle, is embedded throughout the Parthenon. I'll put a link to a video towards the end. J. Capra talks about this, and Balkans has studied it. Phenomenal amount of information in these ancient structures. The Greeks and the Romans learnt their geometry, they learnt their science, they learnt their philosophy and astronomy from the Egyptians, and they incorporated it into their structures as well. Also phenomenal stonework, which doesn't get enough attention. So, the Salama Stone at 3.84 feet, that is a square root of 5 Egyptian royal cubits, as I mentioned, within 1/3 of a millimeter, like well above acceptable standards of measure, even by modern standards, unless you're in a very specialist field, and in considering that the nature of stone, that's again well within acceptable. Now, why is a square root of 5? Well, firstly, the 5:8 ratio of Vitruvian Man might be a hint, but what's really nice about it is that the 1:phi ratio of Vitruvian Man, well, 1 plus the square root of 5 divided by 2 equals phi. The square root of 5 plus 2 equals phi cubed. 1 divided by phi equals 0.618. Phi squared equals 2.618. Phi minus 1 equals 1 over phi. Phi plus 1 equals phi squared. So the golden ratio via Egyptian royal cubits can be extracted from the Salama Stone at a beautiful set of proportions. So the geometry of the Great Pyramid, square root of 5 is so important. It's also built into the King's Chamber. The 2:3 or 3:4 ratio, repeated again through multiple pyramids. Not just the Giza pyramids, but also other structures, including Karnak and Luxor, have wonderful information that can be measured, that will incorporate time via the pendulum to incorporate not just the relative size of the Earth and Moon, but as we will see, very beautiful astronomical information as well. I'm going to link this in the description as well, the Symmetry Festival 2016. Jay Caprath, he's talking about the math and the measurement inside the Parthenon, how it embeds astronomical information, and how the same methods are also built into Indian fire altars. And this connection, the Vedic knowledge. So you've probably heard of Vedic math, or, well, there's so much information embedded in here in a mathematical, measurable sense, and it crosses from ancient India through Sumer, Egypt, Greco-Roman, but also stone circles, also other stone structures such as the Karnak alignments, the Crusono, quadrilateral, the Manio. Yes, it is repeated across the ancient world and has been transmitted through not just measurement systems, as measurement of length, measurement of time, but as we shall see, these same beautiful astronomical geometric connections are also built into systems of weight. And they, just as with the ancient measure systems, such as allegedly modern English foot, the coinage that we still use now is also incorporates this beautiful harmony between multiple sets and sun, earth, moon and stars, essentially built into nature, repeated in temples and through these systems of weights and measurement, which brings us back to whether it's Wa Fu Hsi in China, Hermes, Mercury in the Greco-Roman world, Ningishita you could include in the Sumerian, Babylonian, Chaldean world, or Thoth and Seshat. They're gods of knowledge, maths, architecture, chemistry and medicine, but they're also all gods of weights and measures. This is what links them all. This can be measured in the architecture. It can be measured in astronomy. This was defined by nature. And what is as above, so below. That's what they've done. And so this is the one connecting feature between all of these gods and goddesses. Also, they're the keepers of records and writing as well, which later come to, this will relate to Enoch, Hermes Trismegistus, Pythagoras, as described by the story of Enoch embedding the knowledge prior to the flood. Metatron's cube, the distance from the Great Pyramid at a very important point of the Great Pyramid to Jerusalem, also connections at a very important connection to Heliopolis, but also to the Kaaba, another cube. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the flood, and Gilgamesh speaks to his ancestor Utnapishtim, who describes him building an ark of a cube, 120 by 120 by 120 cubits, and in Revelations, New Jerusalem is a cube of 12,000 by 12,000 by 12,000 stadia, or furlong, and we'll touch on that in the future, because whether it's the Ark of Utnapishtim or New Jerusalem, these cubes also incorporate systems of weights and measure at very specific, very, very important numbers that draw harmonies between geometry, math, music and astronomy, essentially. And it is a measurable, tangible system, and when you start building these all together, the chance of coincidence is infinity to 1. Unfortunately, this is difficult. It can be complex if you're not into your math and geometry, if you're not embedded in metrology, which is a very confusing thing. Even I've immersed myself in it for several years now, and it's still very complicated, but you can reduce it to the royal measures, and by royal measures I mean those which the king or the priest would form their taxation on, the standards of measuring land or measuring valuable goods. But more to come on this. There will be links in the description. This can be weighed, it can be measured, and it is embedded in architecture. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm just all this information so far is going to be necessary as a background to looking deeper into the pyramid, especially the Great Pyramid and other connections in Egypt. So it is necessary. With that, hope you enjoyed and have a good one.